this is that order of change and power and challenge, but wildly compressed, into like a single computing wave of about a decade, right? And so I think it'll break society. I don't understand how it would. I think it'll break society.
And what does that mean, break society?
Real pain, like lots of people feeling a lot of pain.
Anybody else have work up in the air and curious about what the future holds, maybe even looking to reinvent themselves? Then join in. Let's do this. Well, welcome back to Reinvention, my friends. And if you're like most of the people listening to this podcast, you're busy. You're building a career, supporting a family, trying to stay relevant in a world that seems to be changing faster every month. And whether you're excited about AI, skeptical of AI, or honestly a little worried about it, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. This technology is going to reshape how we work, how we learn, and how we live. Now, the challenge is that most conversations about AI are either way too technical or too superficial. They're focused on what's happening today and not where things are actually heading. And that's why I'm so excited about today's guest. Now, a few weeks ago, I had a conversation with Max Ventilla, and I'll be honest, it completely changed the way I think about what's coming next. Max isn't just someone who talks about AI. He spent his career building the technologies that shape the future. Okay, he's a 4-time founder, former Google and Dropbox executive, and he's raised over $1 billion in equity and debt over his career. And right now he's a general partner at Offline Ventures, where he's building and investing in the next generation of AI companies. And before we get into it and talk about the future, I just want to take a moment, Max, and say thank you for coming on here today.
Thanks, Todd.
Yeah, good. So what struck me most about our conversation wasn't your knowledge of AI tools, but how differently you think about it, at least from my perspective. And while most of us are trying to figure out how to use the tools, you're operating in a world of agentic AI, and your default question isn't, how do I do this task? It's, how do I build an agent to do it for me? And you're not thinking just one step ahead, you're thinking 5 or 10 steps ahead. And that's exactly why I wanted you to join me on the show. Because whether you're a manager, an entrepreneur, a professional in the middle of your career, or simply someone trying to understand what's next and what the next decade might look like, it's valuable to hear how people on the front lines of technology think about the future. So in this conversation, Max, we're going to talk about agentic AI, the coming transformation of knowledge work, what happens when everyone has a team of digital assistants working alongside them, and what all this might mean for your career, your company, and your family. So I'm hoping, my listeners, that this conversation stretches your thinking, challenges some of your assumptions, and has you seeing the future just a little bit differently. So Max, you spend your days building and investing in AI. What's something that you believe about the next 5 or 10 years that most smart professionals out there still don't see yet?
Well, when you say smart professionals, I think that's a broad term across industries. And whenever we look broadly across the population, even in the United States, even among kind of people that are professionally successful, most people have not started to use AI. In this little Silicon Valley echo chamber where we're using all the tools, and maybe we've been on these AI chat products since kind of the beginning when they were released. We've watched over multiple years. We're building our own agents. We're starting companies. We are in a little pocket that is experiencing a particular version of the future that may or may not come to pass. That is not what most people are experiencing, right? So I think kind of like the most important thing about AI and, your kind of average executive or manager is that AI has not yet arrived to the average executive or manager. And I think that creates an opportunity, which is it's not really go time yet. There is time, and the pace of change is dizzying. And also most of that change is kind of exploratory on the frontiers and will get consolidated into the kind of main line of how we use the products, in the same way as there's this like main line of how we use the internet, right? And how we use mobile from this broad exploration. And so I think the number one advice I would have is to start using it and start playing with it and not feel pressure to change anything or do anything particularly fast. Now, Obviously, there are some companies, or some roles or some individuals where, like, whatever, you just got laid off. This is a moment to get up the curve faster and in a maybe more targeted way, and maybe retrain to something, or think about how you can do the job you were doing quite differently with this new fuel of AI. I think broadly, though, we're in a time where people should be learning and exploring, and to some extent playing with this stuff, and understanding that the technologies that we have, while they are very powerful in certain ways and really being hailed as this incredible, almost cure-all for everything, like it can do everything and better than we can, these tools are still in the very early innings and have a lot to improve, and I think a lot that will improve over the coming years.
Okay, fair enough. You mentioned the internet revolution and mobile and how that changed our lives. And I don't know if you know this about me, but I started my career working in technology. I worked at DoubleClick for 4 years, from 1997 to 2001. And I remember when I worked there, was talking to my dad, who was an analyst in Merrill Lynch, and he's like, "This internet thing is crazy. I will never put my credit card online. No one will ever do that," right? There was a lot of that, just looking back, about how much things have changed, right? From the internet and mobile, you mentioned as well. But let's talk about this AI revolution that's happening right now, and look out a little bit farther in terms of, what do you foresee, or people like you who are thinking about this from, a longer term perspective? How is it going to change things, right? In the workforce, let's use that as an example, right? What changes are we actually looking at? Because AI is a little bit different, right? This is an intelligence, it's artificial intelligence that's learning and is able to do things essentially by itself. How do you think about that part of it that is different than other technology revolutions that have happened in the past, right? Because I know a lot of the people that I talk to are concerned, right? Oh, well, we're developing this technology that's getting more intelligent and is doing a lot of things, and it'll do my job and stuff like that. And again, I don't really believe in the whole, oh, the world is ending. I think this is an opportunity. But just in general, when I say these things, what comes up to you?
I think a lot. I read a lot. I like to form a nuanced picture over a long period of time about the things that really shape our world, whether it's culture or technology or the environment. And I've been working in and around AI since the late 90s. So it's been a long time of trying to get a sense of, how does this technology work, and what are its limits, and where is it going? And so let's kind of maybe pin down a couple things that I believe, because I think that kind of answers to my question will result from those beliefs or assumptions. So the first is that artificial intelligence is really about these things called neural network, right? Which are artificial neurons that learn to predict some future event based off of some set of historical events, right?
Mm-hmm.
And without getting into kind of too much of the technical detail, these large language models are very large systems of artificial neurons. So you can think about them as little units that will light up with energy or signal based off of what other upstream units have either lit up with or not lit up with. And then that will be part of some downstream picture. And so you have something that comes in on one side, and then it's these kind of like Plinko balls. They light up a bunch of things, and then out the other side comes some state. And that represents this kind of intelligent parsing of some inbound information into some output, where the way that that signal flows through is dependent on what are called these weights, which is, in the kind of like our own brain analogy, neurons that fire together, wire together, neurons that wire together, fire together. And so there's some historical kind of co-firing of these units, where the more two units tended to fire in the past, the more they will fire in the future. And when one lights up, it'll light up the other, right? And so we go through these kind of massive now training runs that are so expensive that only very few companies on earth can kind of afford to do the most performant training of these very large models that cost now billions of dollars for one of these runs to take a huge amount of content and data. Think about it as like all of the historical information that's been stored in some digital form. They get fed in, they impact these weights. And now when some new thing comes along, like, your chat into ChatGPT or like some document you ask Claude to analyze, it basically takes those like words, they're actually tokens, feeds it into that trained model, and out the other side comes some set of words, right? Which is the response of that model, like simplified, right? It's really an agent trained on top of it, blah, blah, blah. But basically, that's the way these things work, right? And so there's a couple things that are worth pointing out. First off, these things are mirrored on how the human brain works, and they are superior in certain ways. So like the consistency of the output based on the input, like is different. They are able to hold like a far greater range of information than what any one human has been exposed to and is able to kind of like learn, right? And they are inferior in many ways. And the main way that they're inferior is that these particular versions of AI, they don't actually understand. They don't really learn in the way that like even a mouse learns, let alone a human learns. And so they're kind of simulating understanding to a much, much greater degree than a human who would take in that same question and provide some response would actually understand what's being asked and what they're saying back, right? And so I think that that will create some current capabilities that we're seeing and also like have very significant limitations that people are working hard to overcome and build the next version and the next version. And it's not obvious how fast and how far we will improve these systems and whether we will require radically new architectures that have yet to really be perfected at scale in the way that this current incarnation of artificial intelligence like has entered the mainstream and had kind of a critical mass of investment and iteration to make it work as well as it does.
So you mentioned something really fascinating there. It's a little philosophical, actually. What is sentience? Like, what is consciousness? Like, how do we make decisions? And you're saying that this current iteration of AI isn't conscious. It's making decisions differently, than a human does or a mouse does, right? But in your opinion, is one of the goals or one of the possible directions that this goes is that it somehow crosses that chasm, and it does become more like us, or more like a mouse, let's say, in terms of the way that it makes choices? Or do you think because it's artificial intelligence that it will remain different? I know it's probably a very hard question to answer, but that's what comes up to me because I kind of love the philosophical side of this. Like, what does this really all mean kind of thing? And so what are people building? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so let's separate out three different categories of concepts. So first, let's talk about concepts that are like in the intelligence realm, and then concepts that are in the understanding realm, and then concepts that are a bit orthogonal to that are in the kind of like self-awareness, sentience, consciousness realm, right? And I think it's important not to conflate those things. So just as an aside, there's a really great sci-fi series. First book's called Old Man's War. And in that series, there's a bunch of alien races that the human kind of defense forces are fighting. And one of those races is incredibly intelligent and not conscious, right? And the author, John Scalzi, does a pretty good job of allowing a reader to get a feel for what it would be like to interact with a being that was very intelligent, very powerful, very capable without the kind of conscious self-awareness that we assume when we encounter someone who has that kind of intelligence. Let me just kind of like detour to something else that I love. I interact with some challenging people sometimes where like it's been years and years and years of feeling like I'm beating my head against the wall, interacting with this person. And there's this book that's kind of like humorous and also it's rigorously done, which is basically about like the laws of stupidity. And it talks about how a stupid person is someone who hurts others without any benefit and maybe even with harm to themselves. And that stupidity has nothing to do with IQ. It has nothing to do with education. It has nothing to do with any other characteristic, whether you're rich or old or anything, right? You can be stupid, completely independent of any other characteristic if you consistently behave in a way that harms others without any benefit to yourself. and that stupid people are actually the most dangerous to like an individual or a society, because like at least the thief who takes from others to benefit from themselves, like is behaving in a rational way.
Right.
Whereas someone who's willing to like hurt others and hurt themselves is very hard to defend against. Right. And so like consciousness, like stupidity, is actually a completely different characteristic of a being versus intelligence. And intelligence is actually a completely different characteristic of a being versus understanding, which is a weird thing that we're really having to confront, right? Like computers for a long time, in some senses, have been intelligent without understanding. And a calculator can do things that normally you would need a person with very high IQ to be able to get the same result. Right. And the thing that's happened now that's weird is suddenly computers are able to speak in natural language in a way that is completely on par with fairly sophisticated humans. And when we feed in domain knowledge, like, medical diagnostics or tech support or molecular gastronomy into one of these large language model based agents that are able to essentially converse the way that an educated human would converse, we get the simulation of understanding and expertise and learning, which is not technically there. It's not binary. It is mostly fake.
So it feels like it's understanding, but it's not, is what you're saying, right? Because those conversations you're having, it's like, it feels like, oh, it really understands me. Just the way that it is, it feels like, but you're saying it doesn't understand you really at all.
Yes. And so here it's worth getting into a little bit of nuance.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's kind of two different kinds of understanding that tend to come together from like a human being, right? Like I'm experiencing it of you right now and you're experiencing it of me. One type of understanding is analytical, conceptual understanding, right? Which is like you said a certain number of words, those words have meaning. I'm able to kind of like construct a conceptual picture of that meaning. I'm able to kind of like, it's almost deductive understanding, but a lot of this happens like almost automatically in my brain, right? And these large language models really don't have that. They're not taking in a bunch of like concepts and forming a complex picture that's generalizable and nuanced. They are razor focused on predicting the next word and the next word and the next word and the next word as they speak, without any understanding of what is the broader concept
that
they're talking about, right? And where are they trying to go in that response? What's fascinating, though, is that there is another component of understanding, which is this kind of holistic, grounded, intuitive. Often we talk about it as like nonverbal.
Yep.
It's a different category than this like deconstructed analytical. And there's a sense in which these agents actually have some of that understanding. It's not coming from them directly. It's coming from basically the source material. I would argue that like, if I have every word that you've ever said to anybody, right? I have the transcript of everything that you, Todd, Jason, have said over like your entire lifetime. And I train one of these agents to like follow the aggregate pattern of when certain words were said to you, what words came back. That actually, when I do that in a fairly like mechanistic, kind of dumb, probabilistic way, there is some sense in which that canon of everything that you've ever said holds in it some kind of imprint of your persona, your personality that gets pulled out.
How do you know that? Like, I'm just curious, like if enough data is put in, there's some level of nonverbal or intuitive wisdom that can come across, right? Which I guess that does make sense to me, but it's still coming from the black and white language itself, right? It's not picking up nuance in other ways.
Well, I think you alluded to it a little bit there, which is like language, words have a certain cognitive power themselves. In fact, a lot of how we can function cognitively is because we are using language, we are using words symbiotically in the way that our own brain functions. We are able to hold more complex thoughts in our head at once by using language versus if we didn't have that technology kind of built into how our brain works, right? And so words themselves and certain aggregate words, and now basically the kind of aggregate, some meaningful fraction of the aggregate knowledge that humans have ever loaded into the internet holds a certain understanding in the way that, like, if you go to Kauai and you bathe in the waters and sit in the forests and let the rain hit you, like, it does something to your body. That ecology has a certain knowing that passes like an understanding.
You're saying that in some way there will be an output that will be impacted. The language that I use will be impacted by my experiences that will eventually, on a large aggregate, convey some information about me and my experience and what I think. That's kind of what you're saying. There is some pass through. Like, Hawaii is not spoken in that moment, but eventually it does get conveyed that over a large data set, it will kind of make sense into my identity in terms of the language that I use.
Yeah, you are going to be put into a state where from that state, the words that will emerge, the neuronal connections that are made are going to be different than if you weren't in that state.
Yeah. No.
And so there's a way in which the body of, I'm going to keep saying words, even though like it's actually more broad than just literal words, but like the body of words that these large language models have been trained on will carry an imprint of understanding into the response that the model gives from the words that you throw at the model. And there is some sense in which there's understanding there, but it's very indirect. It's not that the agent understands, it's that there's some latent understanding that's sitting in these huge artifacts of human expression.
Yeah.
Right? Where there's something almost beautiful about that. And we could actually, we could spend a whole hour talking about mechanically what goes on, the kind of like core building block of how these large language models get built and used is this transformer architecture. And the transformer is doing some almost mystical things in terms of like pulling understanding from source to come up with the next token and the next token and the next token, even though the agent that's doing it has no capacity to understand what it's doing in the same way that, like it's not as if the rock you're sitting on in Kauai understands the knowledge that's flowing through it as you like sit there. Right. And so I don't even think we know what consciousness is for humans or other beings. And so I think that's much harder to pin down for these intelligences. I think we can say these intelligences are intelligent. They have IQ. They are able to do things that require a certain level of ability to manipulate information, but they don't actually understand really. And they're not actually able to learn in the historical sense. The intelligence can be trained, but it's basically just like almost latent dead intelligence versus in any living being. It's constantly evolving and changing through your interaction with it. And I think that that's a real opportunity to build different kinds of intelligences. A lot of what I'm interested in is lower IQ, but higher learning and understanding, where over time, you might ride a very different curve of intelligence. And moreover, there could be a much more natural way that I might relate to agents that I kind of like grow and parent and build trust with over a long period of time on a different curve of value than the current incarnation, which is mainstream, which is like, I'm going to have this very passive, isolated interaction with this centralized superintelligence that is able to do more and more and more without really any internal and not much external guardrail on its output.
Right. Okay. So much there, brother. I love this. And actually, I'm going to put a pin on this because when you talked about the transformer and then doing mystical things that we don't understand, I mean, you know me a little bit. That's like right up I want to go deeper into that conversation at some point with you. Or, I mean, I've worked with a lot of kind of personal development teachers like Tony Robbins and Eckhart Tolle, a lot of like teachers that are very spiritual. And a lot of the words that you're using are some words that, have been around for a long time in terms of how we grow, evolve, our own mind and thinking. So it's just fascinating to hear it coming out in this context. But we don't have endless time today, and I want to keep this on point. So I want to follow up just on two more items, and then I'll let you go. So the first has to do with what you're working on right now, right? Like, so in terms of, the agentic AI and kind of where you're at right now and what you're doing right now and what you see is the most important thing. Let's get very centered on it's 2026. It's the middle of 2026. Things are going to change in a year or two. But right now, what are you seeing, or what is Silicon Valley seeing as the most important things to work on in terms of AI? And then lastly, if we do have time, I do want to hear, you have 3 kids. They're all younger. They're, again, the ages around my daughter's age, maybe a little bit older. I want to hear what your thoughts are as a parent as well, as someone that's building these tools and investing. But why don't we start on that first question, because I think it's fascinating. Talk to me about agentic AI and what you find really hot and interesting right now.
Yeah. So about every 15 years, we get a new computing main platform, right? And so it went from mainframes to personal computers to web connected computers to mobile and cloud enabled computers. And now we're on the next, and there was a little bit of a false start with like AR, VR. There was a little bit of a false start with Web 3. This now kind of Web 4, large language model, AI, agentic computing. It's pretty clear that this is the next humanity scale computing platform that is going to build on the previous computing platforms and represent a completely new set of capabilities and opportunities and challenges. And so I think Silicon Valley is pretty convinced of that. And almost insane how much concentration of venture capital and entrepreneurial energy and content and focus is on like this kind of thing. There's other stuff too, like robotics is definitely something. So like, okay, AI is largely about the digital world, but like, how do you dramatically decrease the cost and increase the availability of physical work, not just, non-physical work, right? So there's kind of AI now, but robotics on probably a 5-year timescale, 10-year timescale, with a similar in the way that like mobile and cloud represented 2 different things, but they kind of came together. So that's the first thing. I would say second, this idea that you have these big monolithic intelligences and also these kind of smaller, like more purpose-built, more controllable intelligences. And a lot of what people are working on right now, a lot of what I'm working on right now are these 2 things called like harnesses, right? Which is like, okay, you have this intelligence, but like, how do you actually constrain it and kind of move it more deterministically through some workflow and through some guardrails to get predictable and performance results? Because without that, the kind of generic general purpose thing, it has a bunch of weird behaviors. And as I said, it provides a bunch of value out of the box, but then it kind of flatlines, even for things like coding,
really,
which are fairly deterministic. Oh yeah, at some point, it becomes pretty critical to like adopt some system for guiding and auditing and controlling the
and an
agent.
AI agent, when you say harness, sorry to interrupt, I just wanted to get clear. So a harness, that's another way to say an agent, something that is harnessed into a more particular,
So an agent is traditionally thought of as a harness plus a model.
Okay.
So a model is one of these big like trained neural networks where like you put a certain set of words in, you get a certain set of words out, but then what are the series of steps and rules and guardrails and tools you give along the way to kind of go from the inputs you're giving it to the outputs you want, not just over a single session, but over many, many sessions that kind of build on each other. So harness is one thing, and then kind of complementary to that is the notion of memory. Basically like if you use ChatGPT, which is itself like a harness plus a model, right? What you'll find is basically incredibly good bullshit artist who says very convincing things that are wildly not true a lot of the time because it doesn't actually understand what it's saying. It's not malicious. It just has no capacity for actual understanding. And so you have to find a way to get what you want, which is something that has a consistent state. Every time you open it, you're not getting like a fresh amnesiac counterparty, that like lies to you all the time, right? And so memory and harness are these two things that like everybody's kind of working on, right? And I'm working on as well. And I think people often have this experience of dealing with technology and feeling like they're dumb. And one of the privileges of working in technology is that like when technology doesn't work for me, which is very, very often, I tend not to feel dumb. I'm like, that wasn't built well. That's not correct. That's not right. There's no reason why I should have to reboot my iPhone 3 times to get it to like correctly configure the new thing that I bought. That's just not well built.
Right.
And so I think it's helpful to default to like, oh, this tool is not good enough. That's why I'm having this frustrating experience. How can I learn more about how this tool works? And how can I be more of a builder myself? I would recommend people use it. I think this is a general purpose, powerful technology at the level of the kind of industrial revolution. I think kind of like computers broadly were a similar power. The fact that like everybody has these computers, but that played out over a very long period of time and it was multiple computing revolutions. Mm-hmm. This is that order of change and power and challenge, but wildly compressed, into like a single computing wave of about a decade, right? And so I think it'll break society.
You do?
I don't understand how it would. At best, I think it'll break society.
And what does that mean, break society?
Real pain, like lots of people feeling a lot of pain, of like disruption of their lives and emotional challenge and not feeling safe. And it will require the kind of breaking of the bones of society in terms of how we think about work and how we think about the safety net and how we think about education, how we think about money. Like I have never felt as uncertain in my adult life on a medium timescale about what's going to happen. And you asked about kids, I have a 15-year-old, almost 13-year-old and a 9-year-old girl, boy. And I have no idea what the working world that they're going to go into is going to be like. My 15-year-old, most of the time that I see her with her friends, every single one of them is actively looking at their phone while next to each other, most of the time. And that's a major shift from 10, 15 years ago, what it was like to be a teenager, right? I think this is going to be a much bigger shift.
Right.
10, 15 years from now, what it's going to be like to be early career, 20 something, when there are digital beings around that are doing much of the work that humans historically were doing. Right. And so I think that we have to inhabit this question of if all the work that you did last year was free, how are you going to take advantage of that? How is that going to be a good thing for your life instead of a terrible thing for your life, for society, for your community, for your family versus a terrible thing? And I like the idea of other people's work being free. I mean, I have some empathy and I care about society, but like, it's exciting to me that I could have a house built for free, or I could get the best cancer diagnosis for free, or I could have the best landscape garden design for free, or like a musician to play me the song that I invent for free. Like, that's cool. It's kind of freaky when I turn it towards like, what was my own value? What did I do? Right. And so I think this is like akin to being physically strong. Pre-industrial revolution was worth a lot more than when fossil fuels could be asked to do the work that a human used to have to do, or that an animal used to have to do, where like animals required a lot more effort to like get that, caloric output from than like a fossil fuel did. Right. And we're going through a similar transition. We're just doing it on a wildly compressed timescale. And so I think it requires us each to be active about learning these things and understanding how they work and how we can use them, and also building. I don't think you can just listen to YouTube videos and read books. Like you have to take on some project that you are excited about and start to move towards like collaborating on that project with like digital beings instead of human beings. Now, I think we've taken it too far in Silicon Valley and we've become obsessed with, well, I don't even need humans and I don't need to interact with other humans. And I'm just like, where does that lead us in terms of like our humanity? right? We're already seeing the social isolation from people just kind of like dopamine hitting the next, item in their feed, the next item in their feed. Where does that take us when like we're getting real human relationship simulation from digital beings, right? As a substitute. And so I think this is about collaborating with other humans with digital beings in the mix more than substituting for humans with digital beings so that we can all like lie on a beach and not have to do anything anymore. That latter positioning, I think, is not realistic and not ultimately helpful for society.
Right. Thank you, Max. And just well said on that last part. That was our conversation last week was around that, like the building communities of digital beings and humans, and I think you're exploring that option. Really fascinating, Max. I mean, we're gonna end this right now. One last quick question. You don't have to answer very long here. Just curious, are you hopeful about the future? Do you have optimism about the future? I mean, I think we're all have some fear around what's happening. Or how do you hold it? I've read stuff where there's a lot of movement and talk in Silicon Valley that we need to stop it. We need to pause it so that way we can, look at society and look at the structures that we have as a human culture and make the proper adjustments to account for what's going to go down here. But there's also the sense that you can't really stop it, that there's really no stopping it. So I'm just curious, in the juxtaposition of that, how do you hold it? Are you positive or do you have real concerns?
Oh, I mean, definitely a large extent of both. On the health side, I think we are being insanely cavalier about a technology that has lots of ways that it can go wrong and very few ways that it can go right. So I think generally slowing down, more coordination, more regulation are absolutely imperative. The analogies to kind of nuclear weapons are pretty obvious, and we regulate that. We control it. We have international treaties, so I would love to see the number one item by far on like US-China relations be how do we regulate this stuff? How do we slow it down?
Right.
I think that every frontier lab is not a normal for-profit company operating in like unways because even they realize that this technology is incredibly dangerous. Like I think a lot of the kind of call for regulation from the companies themselves is genuine. They need multi-party coordination. And so I want to see more of that. I also just think there's interesting Neo Labs. There's an interesting company called Slowmax that Emmett Shear started, which is like creating alternate AI architectures where like the AI actually has a theory of mind and an ability to understand itself and an ability to understand others. And it's much more of this kind of like emergent collective, lots of beings adding up to superintelligence, which I think is a much more stable, natural approach to AGI and superintelligence than kind of like the leading architecture right now, which are these like massive, trained, insular beings that don't understand and yet are becoming more and more and more powerful. I struggle to see how that could possibly end well. I think there are alternatives, and I'm hopeful that, we'll do the thing that we've always done as humans, which is like to learn and adapt and figure stuff out.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm grateful, Max, that we know each other and that you agreed to come on to the show today, and excited to get this out because I just think it's fascinating. Maybe it's the start of something we can do periodically every 6 months or so to check in, because like these conversations are as important as they get right now. So I appreciate your time and your attention, and rooting for you and what you're doing. I'll be following along, and until next time, thanks for being here.
Likewise. Thanks, Todd.
This is the moment I break through.